That turned out very nicely. Pretty nicely charged now. That'll fit over that nicely. That turned out quite nicely. Your power supply is working nicely. This is going nicely. It's pretty nicely. Really nicely. It's bubbling nicely. Fits really nicely. Quite nicely. Coming along nicely. Pretty nicely, but it's quite nicely. Pretty nicely. Quite nicely. Nicely. Really nicely. I think those will fit nicely. They're working out really nicely. Battery's coming along nicely. Fairly nicely. Very nicely. They're nicely well held up nicely. Quite nicely. And these out nicely. Ooh, it's coming along nicely. It's working out really nicely. That fits in there nicely. All hooked up nicely. Turned out really nicely. Dissolved nicely. Work nicely. Work really nicely. Do the metal pretty nicely. Quite nicely. Quite nicely. It's coming along really nicely. Fit really nicely. Rocks back and forth nicely. Going nicely. Quite nicely. Mounted nicely. Nicely. It's a nicely sized piece of roofing. Starting to grow nicely. Well, that looks pretty nicely. Looks nicely. Well, this worked out really nicely. And that works nicely. Quite nicely. Pretty nicely. Pretty nicely. Really nicely. That worked out pretty nicely. I think I'm packed up nicely. Recharger nicely. And the battery charger's connected to the battery nicely. Clean these up nicely. You can weld quite nicely. Nicely sized. Pretty nicely. Really nicely. Lights up the yard pretty nicely. I think it fits pretty nicely. And it works really nicely. Scale nicely. Battery's coming along nicely. Battery fits nicely and really nicely. Really nicely. 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 More nicely. Pretty nicely. Nicely. Works nicely. Really working nicely. And really nicely. Fit in there nicely. Working quite nicely. Mow quite nicely. They fit in there quite nicely. They're installed nicely and it works nicely. Pretty nicely. Quite nicely. It fits really nicely. And I should clean it up nicely. Those are going nicely. Quite nicely.